The Kapp Putsch, also known as the Kapp-Lüttwitz Putsch after its leaders Wolfgang Kapp and Walther von Lüttwitz, was an attempted coup on 13 March 1920 which aimed to undo the German Revolution of 1918–1919, overthrow the Weimar Republic and establish a right-wing autocratic government in its place. It was supported by parts of the Reichswehr and other conservative, nationalist and monarchist factions. The coup took place in the capital, Berlin, and the legitimate German government was forced to flee the city. The coup failed after a few days, when large sections of the German population followed a call by the government to join a general strike. Most civil servants refused to cooperate with Kapp and his allies. Despite its failure, the putsch had significant consequences for the future of the Weimar Republic. It was the cause of the left-wing Ruhr uprising of March 1920, which the government suppressed by military force, whilst dealing leniently with those behind the putsch. These events polarized the electorate, resulting in a shift in the majority after the June Reichstag elections. Background: after Germany had lost World War I, the German Revolution of 1918–1919 ended the monarchy and the German Empire was abolished and a democratic system, the Weimar Republic, was established in 1919 by the Weimar National Assembly. Right-wing nationalist and militarist circles opposed the new republic and promoted the stab-in-the-back myth, claiming that the war had been lost only because the brave efforts of the undefeated German military had been undermined by civilians at home. In 1919–20, the government of Germany was formed by the Weimar coalition, consisting of the Social Democratic Party, German Democratic Party and Zentrum. President Friedrich Ebert, Chancellor Gustav Bauer and Defense Minister Gustav Noske were all members of the SPD. According to the Constitution, the President was the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, represented in peacetime by the Minister of Defense. The most senior officer of the land forces was called Chef der Heeresleitung, a post held in early 1920 by General Walther Reinhardt. Gustav Bauer was forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, even though he disagreed with it. The treaty had been dictated by the victorious allies of World War I. It forced Germany to assume sole responsibility for the war, reduced the area of Germany and imposed reparation payments and military restrictions on the nation. In early 1919, the strength of the Reichswehr, the regular German army, was estimated at 350,000, with more than 250,000 men enlisted in the various Freikorps, volunteer paramilitary units, largely consisting of returning soldiers from the war. The German government had repeatedly used Freikorps troops to put down communist uprisings after the war. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which came into effect on 10 January 1920, Germany was required to reduce its land forces to a maximum of 100,000 men. The initial deadline was set for 31 March 1920. Freikorps units were expected to be disbanded, since the reason for the creation, internal repression, had become obsolete with the crushing of the leftist uprisings. They were becoming a threat to the government. Some senior military commanders had started discussing the possibility of a coup as early as July 1919. The coup. Run-up to the coup. Although the putsch has been named after Wolfgang Kapp, a 62-year-old nationalist East Prussian civil servant, who had been planning a coup against the Republic for a while, it was instigated by the military. Kapp played a supporting role On 29 February 1920, the Defense Minister Noske ordered the disbandment of two of the most powerful Freikorps, the Marine Brigade Lohenfeld and Marine Brigade Erhard. The latter numbered from 5,000 to 6,000 men and had been stationed at the Truppenübungsplatz near Berlin since January 1920. An elite force, it had been created from former Imperial Navy officers and NCOs boosted later by Walther. During the Civil War in 1919, the brigade had seen action in Munich and Berlin. It was extremely opposed to the democratic government of Friedrich Ebert. Its commander, Korvettenkapitän Hermann Erhard, declared that the unit would refuse its dissolution. On the 1st of March, it staged a parade without inviting Noske. General Walther von Lüttwitz, in command of all the regular troops in and around Berlin, the highest-ranking general in the army at the time and in command of many Freikorps, said at the parade that he would not accept the loss of such an important unit. Several of Lüttwitz's officers were horrified at this open rejection of the government's authority and tried to mediate by setting up a meeting between Lüttwitz and the leaders of the two major right-wing parties. Lüttwitz listened to and remembered their ideas but was not dissuaded from his course of action. Noske then removed the Marine Brigade from Lüttwitz's command and assigned it to the leadership of the Navy, hoping that they would disband the unit. Lüttwitz ignored the order but agreed to a meeting with President Ebert, suggested by his staff. In the evening of the 10th of March, Lüttwitz came with his staff to Ebert's office. Ebert had also asked Noske to attend. Lüttwitz, drawing on demands by the right-wing parties and adding his own, now demanded the immediate dissolution of the National Assembly, new elections for the Reichstag, the appointment of technocrats as secretaries for foreign affairs, economic affairs and finance, the dismissal of General Reinhardt, appointment of himself as supreme commander of the regular army and the revocation of the orders of dissolution for the Marine Brigade. Ebert and Noske rejected these demands and Noske told Lüttwitz that he expected his resignation the next day. Lüttwitz went to Dobritz on the 11th of March and asked Erhard whether he would be able to occupy Berlin that evening. Erhard said he needed another day, but in the morning of the 13th of March he could be in the center of Berlin with his men. Lüttwitz gave the order and Erhard began the preparations. It was only at this point that Lüttwitz brought the group known as Nationale Vereinigung into the plot. These included German National People's Party member Wolfgang Kapp, retired General Erich Ludendorff and Waldemar Pabst, who had been behind the murder of Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg in January 1919, and Truott von Jagow, the last Berlin head of police in the Old Reich. The goal was to establish an authoritarian regime with a return to the federal structure of the empire. Lüttwitz asked them to be ready to take over the government on the 13th of March. The group was unprepared but agreed to the schedule set by Lüttwitz. One factor making them support quick action was that sympathetic members of the Sicherheitspolizei in Berlin informed them that warrants for their arrest had been issued that day. Lüttwitz was not dismissed but suspended from his post on the 11th of March. To defend the government, Noske ordered 2 regiments of Sicherheitspolizei and 1 regular regiment to take position in the government quarter but doubted that a putsch was imminent. The regimental commanders decided not to follow orders to shoot, a decision that received the approval of Chef des Troupes General Hans von Seecke. Occupation of Berlin. The reluctance to shed blood was one-sided. On the evening of the 12th of March, Erhard ordered his brigade to march into Berlin, to ruthlessly break any resistance, and to occupy the center of the city with the government buildings. The brigade, sporting swastikas on the helmets and vehicles, started off towards Berlin at around 10 p.m. An hour later the Gruppenkommando knew about it and informed formed NOSC. Two general officers met Erhard and convinced him to give the government a chance to surrender before being taken into custody, assuming that all of Lüttwitz's demands were accepted by 7 a.m. This was reported to NOSC, who met with Ebit. Ebit then called a cabinet meeting for 4 a.m. At 1 a.m. NOSC asked the senior commanders to his office in the Bendler block. NOSC asked the commanders to defend the government buildings but was turned down. All but 2 of the officers refused to follow in order to shoot at the rebel troops. Some suggested negotiations, others claimed that the troops would not understand in order to fire. Some argued that the regular units would not be able to defeat the elite Marine Brigade. Seekt spoke about comradeship. His exact words were not recorded but have been reported as "Troops do not fire on troops. So, you perhaps intend, Herr Minister, that a battle be fought before the Brandenburg Tor between troops that have fought side by side against a common enemy. When Reichswehr fires on Reichswehr, all comradeship within the officers' corps will have vanished." Others have quoted Siekt's words as the even more succinct, "Reichswehr does not fire on Reichswehr." NOSC, depressed enough by the disloyalty of the military to speak about suicide to an aide, reported to the cabinet at 4 a.m. At a confused meeting that the Reichskanzlei, the undefended cabinet took 2 decisions: to flee the city and to issue a call for a general strike. These were not unanimous. The Vice-Chancellor Eugen Schiffer and some of the other non-SPD ministers refused to leave the city, to preserve the opportunity to negotiate with the putschists. Only Ebert and the SPD ministers signed the call for a general strike. At 6:15 a.m. they had to interrupt the meeting and flee. Within 10 minutes of their departure, the Marine Brigade reached the Brandenburg Tor, where it was met by Lüttwitz, Ludendorff, Kapp and the followers. Shortly thereafter, Kapp's men moved into the Reichskanzlei. Supported by a battalion of regular Reichswehr, they occupied the government quarter. Kapp declared himself chancellor and formed a provisional government. Lüttwitz served as commander of the armed forces and Minister of Defense. Several well-known conservatives and former secretaries of state were invited to assume government positions but declined. International conman Ignaz Trebitsch Lincoln became Kapp's press censor. Reactions: there was no military resistance to the putsch. The regular troops in Berlin, Sicherheitspolizei, Navy, the army commands of East Prussia, Pomerania, Brandenburg and Silesia formally accepted the new Minister of Defense and Reichskanzler. Admiral Adolf von Trotha, the Navy commander, came out in support of the coup as soon as he learned of it. In Bavaria, the Reichswehr toppled the Social Democratic state government and replaced it with the right-wing regime of Gustav Ritter von Kahr. In the rest of the Reich, the commanders of the Wehrkreis did not declare for or against Kapp but were not neutral and most sympathized more or less openly with the putschists. The upper echelons of the bureaucracy were still dominated by those who had risen to the positions under the empire, and most were sympathetic to the coup, whilst remaining outwardly neutral and biding the time. In the eastern provinces, the bureaucracy fell in line behind Kapp and Lüttwitz. The government moved to Dresden, where they hoped to get support from General Major Mayrke, but he had been ordered by Berlin to take them into protective custody, and they moved on to Stuttgart. The Cabinet Proclamation on the 13th of March, calling on German workers to defeat the putsch by means of a general strike, met with enormous success and received massive support from the working class. The majority unions, sympathetic to the government dominated by Social Democrats, joined the call for a strike on the same day, as did the Independent Social Democratic Party and the Democratic Party. The Communist Party of Germany followed 1 day later. In Berlin, the strike started on the 14th of March, and by the next day it had spread all over the Reich. It was the most powerful strike ever in Germany, involving involving up to 12 million workers, and the country was paralyzed. In Berlin, the gas, water and power supply stopped. Adolf Hitler, who had been in contact with the members of the Nationale Vereinigung and was eager to help the coup along, was flown into Berlin from Munich by the army. The pilot was Robert von Grimm, whom Hitler later appointed as the last commander of the Luftwaffe. He was met by striking workers at an airfield outside of Berlin, where he landed by mistake, and had to disguise himself. Collapse with the country paralyzed. Kapp and Lüttwitz were unable to govern. In Berlin, communication between military units was by courier only. The rank and file of the bureaucracy were on strike, and there were no newspapers. Proclamations asking the workers to return to their jobs, promises of new elections and even the threat of capital punishment for strikers remained without results, and the putsch collapsed on the 17th of March. 4 days after it had begun, Kapp had put Vice-Chancellor Schiffer and the members of the Prussian state government into protective custody on the 13th of March, but they were released the next day, and on the 15th of March, negotiations began. Representatives of the Democratic Right, Oskar Herg and Gustav Stresemann, also participated. The four big center-right parties agreed that the main threat was now Bolshevism, and that they had to win back the officer corps. It was considered undesirable that Kapp and Lüttwitz should be toppled. They must be seen to resign voluntarily. The four parties, supported by some Social Democrats who had remained in Berlin, offered fresh elections, a cabinet reshuffle and an amnesty for all participants in the putsch, if Kapp and Lüttwitz were to resign. The putschists offered only the resignation of Kapp, and Lüttwitz tried to hold on for another day as head of a military dictatorship, but his commanders deserted him. They suggested to Schiffer, in the absence of Ebert in charge of the government's affairs, that he appoint Siecht as head of the Reichswehr, which Schiffer did in the name of Ebert. When Lüttwitz offered his resignation on the 18th of March, Schiffer accepted, again in Ebert's name, while granting him full pension rights. Schiffer also suggested Pabst and Lüttwitz should leave the country, until the National Assembly had decided on the question of an amnesty, and even offered them false passports and money. On the 18th of March, Siecht praised the discipline of the Marine Brigade Erhardt, and the next day provided Erhardt with a written promise that he would not be arrested as long as he was in command of the brigade, and the brigade left Berlin. When they were heckled by an unfriendly crowd of bystanders, they opened fire with machine guns, leaving 12 civilians dead and 30 severely wounded. Kapp remained in the country and only fled to Sweden in April. Lüttwitz first went to Saxony and only later left for Hungary. Both men used passports provided by supporters in the police. Erhardt went into hiding in Bavaria. Aftermath. In 2009, Leighton wrote, "At first sight, the collapse of the Kapp Putsch could be viewed as a major success for the Weimar Republic. In the 6 days of crisis, it had retained the backing of the people of Berlin and had effectively withstood a major threat from the extreme right." Quote, "Among the grievances which Kapp and his followers had against the government were that the National Assembly, which had been elected to serve temporarily, was beginning to act as a permanent Reichstag, and that it seemed this assembly might revise the constitution with respect to the election of the President of the Republic, which would make the Reichstag, rather than the electorate, responsible for the presidential election. As a consequence of the promise made to the putschists, the National Assembly was dissolved in April, and the date of the general election for the first Republican Reichstag was brought forward to the 6th of June, so that the German people could express their feelings regarding the terms of the Versailles Treaty. All attempts to change the method of election for the presidency of the Republic were abandoned. In the Reichstag elections of 6 June, the number of votes cast for the SPD and the Democratic Party fell by more than half, compared to the January 1919 elections, while the extreme right-wing German People's Party and the extreme left-wing USPD gained substantially. The Weimar coalition lost its majority in parliament and would never regain it. The SPD had made a pact with the army, which resulted in communist workers being shot dead, so the left was permanently fractured. Ebert told the army it was free to arrange its own affairs, thereby forming a state within a state implacably opposed to Weimar that eventually was central to the right-wing coup against the Prussian state government in 1932. Essentially, the collapse of Weimar cannot be understood without understanding the Kapp Putsch and its consequences. The effect of the Kapp-Lüttwitz Putsch throughout Germany were more lasting than in Berlin. In some parts of the country, the strike had turned into an armed revolt. The violence came from local military commanders who supported the new government and arrested pickets, which the workers resisted. In Thuringia and Saxony, the military defeated the workers after bloody fights. In the Ruhr, the workers won and did not stop after the putsch in Berlin had collapsed. In what became known as the Ruhr Uprising, a Red Ruhr army went on the offensive. On the 17th of March it took Dortmund, on the 18th of March Hamm and Bochum, and on the 19th of March Essen, causing the local Wehrkreis at Munster to order a withdrawal. By the 22nd of March, the Ruhr was under the control of the revolutionary workers. The legitimate government returned to Berlin on the 20th of March and asked for the general strike to be ended. To achieve this, it offered some concessions to the unions, some of them made in bad faith. The unions demanded the creation of a new government made up of SPD and USPD, led by Karl Legien, but only a new government based on the Weimar coalition found a majority in the National Assembly and Hermann Müller replaced Bauer as chancellor. The government then tried to negotiate with workers who refused to lay down their arms, after the unions called off the strike on the 22nd of March. When the negotiations failed, the revolt in the Ruhr was suppressed by Reichswehr and Freikorps in early April 1920. Hundreds of people were killed, many in summary executions, some committed by units that had been involved in the putsch, including Marine Brigade Erhard, as in 1918–1919. Those on the left had cause to accuse the SPD and the Ebert government of siding with the enemies of the workers and of the Republic. The putsch left a rump of military conspirators such as Pabst and Erhard, who found refuge in Bavaria under the right-wing government of Gustav von Kahr, and there attempted to organize plots against the Republican constitution and government of Germany. The crisis in the relations of Bavaria with the Reich, which ended in Kahr's resignation, was a further phase of the same trouble. After the putsch, Noske named Kapp, Pabst and Erhard as being responsible, despite the support from much higher up in the army. Most of the participants were granted an amnesty, and on the 2nd of August 1920, the Reichstag passed a law that exculpated crimes committed during the putsch and the subsequent Ruhr uprising, except those due to cruelty or self-interest. Of 705 cases brought against civilians, only the prosecution of von Jagow ended with a guilty verdict. Freikorps and Reichswehr members were subject to military law, and of 775 court-martials, 486 cases were closed. 48 officers were removed from the posts, 6 resigned, the others were subject to mild disciplinary actions. The Marine Brigade Erhard was dissolved in May 1920, but most of its members were allowed to join the Reichswehr, where they had successful careers. The courts were much harsher on the members of the Red Ruhr Army, many of whom were sentenced to lengthy terms of imprisonment. Kapp was arrested in Sweden on the 16th of April but not deported to Germany. He voluntarily returned to Germany in April 1922 and died the same year in prison while awaiting trial. Lüttwitz returned to Germany as part of an amnesty in 1924. Gustav Noske was forced to resign by the unions on the 22nd of March, as a condition for ending the general strike and because some in the SPD thought that he had not been tough enough facing up to the putschists. Otto Gessler succeeded Noske as defense minister. General Reinhardt also resigned out of protest at Noske's dismissal. General Seeck became his successor as Chef der Heeresleitung. Monument to the March Dead between 1920 and 1922. A monument in honor of the workers who were killed in the wake of the Kapp Putsch was erected in the Weimar Central Cemetery. The memorial was commissioned by the Weimar Gewerkschaftskartell and built according to plans submitted to a competition by the architectural office of Walther Gropius. Although Gropius maintained that the Bauhaus should remain politically neutral, he agreed to participate in the competition staged among Weimar artists at the end of 1920. The monument was arranged around an inner space, in which visitors could stand. The repeatedly fractured and highly angular memorial rose up on three sides as if thrust up from a rammed into the earth. Bibliography. Erger, Johannes. Der Kapp-Lüttwitz Putsch. Ein Beitrag zur deutschen Innenpolitik 1920. Beitrag zur Geschichte des Parlamentarismus und der politischen Partien. 35. Drost, Konemann, Erwin, Schulze, Gerhard. Der Kapp-Lüttwitz Putsch. Dokumente. Olzog. ISBN 3789293,555. McElligott, Anthony. Weimar, Germany. Oxford University Press.